Welcome, and thank you for being here tonight. Together we leave behind the noise of the day and drift toward a quieter place, where history murmurs in the distance and time moves a little slower. It means a lot that you're here, allowing my voice to keep you company in this calm space before sleep. If you'd like to support this journey, a like, a comment, or a quiet subscription can help keep the candle burning. Just a small gesture, but deeply appreciated. And if you feel like sharing, tell me in the comments, which historical era would you visit if you could dream yourself there tonight? Let your imagination wander, and let's collect these night travels one by one. This is Educational Bedtime, where the stories are long, the tone stays soft, and the past unfolds slowly like parchment beneath candlelight. Now, let your shoulders sink, let your breath deepen, and your thoughts quiet down like dust settling on ancient stone. Tonight, we journey into the towering heart of the Himalayas, not the tourist trails or glossy photos, but the hidden lives of those who once braved winters so long, so cold, that even memory froze alongside the rivers. 4 stories await us: the rhythm of survival, the echo of a hermit's prayer, the snow-covered secrets of vanished gods, and the lives of nobles who drank tea while others dug graves in the frost. Let us begin with smoke, snow, and silence. Chapter 1. Life in a Himalayan winter village. Imagine waking before the sun has even considered rising. The sky is a deep blue-black. The stars, fierce and close, burn above your head like cold fire. Your eyes open slowly, your lashes crusted with frost. The wool blanket is stiff with ice where your breath touched it in the night. You reach for your shoes, not by the bed but tucked near the fire pit, where the last embers try to remember their heat. There is no central heating, no buzzing radiators or digital thermostats. There is only the fire, and even it must be coaxed gently back to life. You blow softly into the coals, shielding them with your hands. Your fingers are numb, but this is not new. This is your life, as it was your mother's and your grandmother's. The altitude here sits at nearly 14,000 feet above sea level. At this height, the air itself seems thin, crystalline, each breath a conscious effort. The oxygen carries less weight, each inhalation a deliberate act of survival. Your lungs have adapted over generations, expanded and strengthened, but still the cold bites at your throat with every breath. The morning air is so sharp it could cut glass, so pure it makes your eyes water. This is the world of the high Himalayas, where winter isn't just a season, it's a way of existence. Outside, the snow is not falling. It has already fallen. Layers upon layers have accumulated through the months, each storm adding another foot, another barrier between you and the world below. The snow will not leave for many, many weeks, perhaps not until the late spring winds carry the scent of distant valleys upward, warming the peaks just enough to begin the slow, inevitable melt. But that is months away, and right now, in this moment, winter owns everything. The path to the water source is buried, but you know it. Your feet know it. Your grandfather's feet knew it. This knowledge passes through generations like prayer, each step a meditation on survival. You walk it every day, carrying your copper pots to the spring. The metal is so cold it burns your palms, but copper holds warmth better than clay. And warmth is currency here. Meltwater, glacial and sharp, trickles from a stone crevice in the rock. The sound is musical, almost supernatural, as if the mountain itself is singing in whispers. You do not rush. You cannot. The cold punishes sudden movement. Every gesture must be deliberate, every step calculated. Rush, and you sweat. Sweat and the moisture freezes against your skin. Frozen sweat can kill you just as surely as hunger. Your body has learned patience, has learned the rhythm of survival. Walk slowly, breathe deeply, move with purpose but never with haste. This is the first lesson of winter survival, learned before words, before conscious thought. You carry the water back. It is heavy, but warm compared to the air. The weight of it reminds you of life, of the precious liquid that keeps blood flowing, keeps breath misting in the frozen air. You will use it to cook, to clean, to breathe steam back into your lungs when the dryness becomes unbearable. Water is life, and life is water. In these heights, you never waste a drop. The children are taught to catch snowflakes on their tongues, to appreciate every source of moisture. The village sits in a valley carved by ancient glaciers. Massive peaks rise on all sides, their summits lost in clouds that never seem to move. The mountains are not just landscape here, they are presence. They watch over the village like sleeping giants, their faces changing with the light. At dawn they glow pink and gold. At midday they shine white and blue. At dusk they turn purple and black. The villagers know each peak by name, by mood, by the way the weather behaves around its slopes. What do people eat when the earth is a tomb of ice? The answer is what they can store and what they can ferment. The harvest season, brief and precious, determines survival for the entire year. Families work together during the short summer months, gathering and preserving everything the harsh landscape provides. Dried turnips, their surfaces wrinkled and hard as leather, hang in braided strings from the rafters. Smoked meat, dark and concentrated, stores the essence of life in strips that can last through the longest winter. Stone-hard barley bread, baked in thick slabs and stored in wooden chests, provides the foundation of every meal. Occasionally, a handful of foraged roots, dug from beneath shallow snow where the sun briefly warmed the land. These treasures are found by the children, whose sharp eyes can spot the telltale signs of life beneath the white blanket. A slight discoloration in the snow, a barely visible stem, the memory of where plants grew during the brief summer. Each root is cleaned carefully, examined for quality, then either eaten immediately or dried for later use. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is taken for granted. Butter tea, thick and salty, made with fermented yak butter, is sipped not for pleasure, but for calories. This ancient drink, known locally as pocha or gurgocha, is more than sustenance. It is survival distilled into liquid form. The tea leaves come from distant valleys, traded for precious salt and wool. The yak butter, aged and pungent, provides the fats necessary to maintain body heat in the endless cold. Salt, more valuable than gold at these altitudes, helps retain moisture and maintain the delicate balance of minerals in the body. The preparation of butter tea is a ritual, a meditation on survival. The tea leaves are boiled in water, then strained into a wooden churn. The butter, scraped from its storage container, is added along with the salt. Then comes the churning, a rhythmic process that blends the ingredients into a smooth, nourishing drink. The sound of churning fills the morning air, a percussion of life that accompanies the waking village. Our children learn to churn before they can properly walk, their small hands guided by mothers and grandmothers who learned the same way. The butter itself comes from the yaks, those massive, shaggy creatures that are perfectly adapted to this harsh environment. Yaks are more than livestock here. They are partners in survival. Their thick coats provide wool for blankets and clothing. Their milk becomes butter and cheese. Their dung, dried and stored, becomes fuel for the fire when wood is scarce. Their meat, when an animal is lost to cold or injury, provides protein through the winter months. Their very presence provides companionship in the isolation of winter. Everything is rationed, not by choice, but by necessity. The storage rooms beneath each household, the mathematical equation of survival. So many people, so many months, so much food. The calculations are made during harvest time, when families gather to divide resources and plan for the winter ahead. Too generous early in the season, and the family starves in spring. Too stingy, and malnutrition weakens the body's ability to generate heat. The balance is delicate, precise, perfected over generations of trial and error. Meals are small, but frequent. A handful of barley bread with butter tea for breakfast. A cup of soup made from dried vegetables and perhaps a small piece of meat for midday. Another cup of tea, and some dried fruits for the evening. So the stomach is never completely full, but it is never completely empty. Hunger is a constant companion, but starvation is held at bay by careful planning and community cooperation. When one family's stores run low, neighbors share. When the shared stores run low, the entire community tightens its collective belt. And yet, there is peace. In the stillness of it all, when the wind stops, there is a silence deeper than silence. You can hear your own heartbeat, the creak of the roof above your head, the sigh of steam escaping from a cooking pot, the soft whisper of snow settling on the walls, the distant call of a snow leopard, wild and free. This silence is not empty, it is full of presence, of awareness, of the deep connection between human and mountain. that has sustained life here for thousands of years. The homes themselves are built low and heavy. Their walls are made of stacked stone, each rock carefully selected for size and shape. The stones are fitted together with minimal mortar, relying on gravity and careful engineering to create walls that can withstand the tremendous pressure of accumulated snow and the expansion and contraction of extreme temperature changes. The roofs are layered with packed mud and grass, creating insulation that keeps the interior warm while allowing the structure to breathe. The architecture here represents thousands of years of adaptation to extreme climatic conditions. These structures are not built for beauty, but for survival. Every element serves a purpose. Every design choice is dictated by the need to maintain warmth and stability in one of the world's harshest environments. The walls are thick, sometimes 3 feet deep, filled with smaller stones and mud that create natural insulation. The windows are small and positioned to maximize the precious winter sunlight, while minimizing heat loss. Each window is fitted with wooden shutters that can be sealed completely during the worst storms. Some families sew yak wool into thick tapestries, not for decoration, but to hang over doorways, to block the wind that snakes through every crack. These tapestries are works of art, born from necessity. Over generations of women have perfected the techniques of spinning yak wool into thread, dyeing it with natural pigments found in the high valleys, then weaving it into patterns that tell the story of their families and their faith. The tapestries are heavy, dense with wool and memory. They move gently in the drafts, creating a barrier between the outside world and the precious warmth within. The floors are packed earth, covered with thick rugs woven from yak hair and sheep wool. These rugs are not luxuries but necessities. They provide insulation from the frozen ground, cushioning for bodies that must sleep on hard surfaces, and additional warmth for families who huddle together during the coldest nights. The rugs are cleaned regularly, taken outside during the brief summer months to be beaten and aired, then brought back inside for another year of service. In one corner of each home stands a prayer flag, and another, a flickering lamp fueled by animal fat. The prayer flag is made of colored cloth, inscribed with sacred texts and prayers for protection, prosperity, and good health. The colors have meaning: blue for sky, white for clouds, red for fire, green for water, yellow for earth. The flag moves with the slightest breeze, sending prayers into the universe with each flutter. The lamp burns continuously, its flame a tiny sun in the darkness of winter. The fat that fuels it comes from the yaks, rendered down and stored in small containers that provide light and a small amount of heat throughout the long nights. The fire is sacred. It is never left alone. This is not superstition but survival strategy. Fire is life, and life must be protected at all costs. When you leave the house, even to fetch water or check on the goats, someone stays behind, always, watching it, feeding it, protecting it. The fire is fed with dried yak dung, precious wood brought up from the valley, and dried grass gathered during the summer months. Each fuel source burns differently, produces different amounts of heat, lasts for different lengths of time. The fire tender learns to read the flames like a book, understanding what each color and shape means, knowing when to add fuel and when to let it burn down. To let the fire die would be like letting someone die. The metaphor is not metaphor at all. Without fire, there is no warmth. Without warmth, there is no survival. The fire provides heat for cooking, for boiling water, for drying wet clothes, provides light for working during the long winter nights. It provides comfort for the soul when the isolation becomes overwhelming. It provides the focal point around which family life revolves, the hearth that makes a house a home. Children are taught from the time they can walk how to feed the fire, how to move the logs, just so, how to listen for the cough of wet wood and the sigh of dry. They learn to recognize the different sounds fire makes, the way it speaks to those who know how to listen. A healthy fire whispers and crackles. A dying fire gasps and pops. A fire that needs attention hisses and smokes. The children learn to add fuel gradually, never smothering the flames, always maintaining the delicate balance between fuel and air that keeps combustion alive. The knowledge is passed down through demonstration and practice. Grandmothers guide small hands as they place twigs on the coals. Fathers show sons how to bank the fire at night, creating a bed of coals that can be coaxed back to flame in the morning. Mothers teach daughters how to cook over the fire, how to regulate temperature by adjusting the fuel, how to keep soup simmering without burning. This knowledge is more valuable than gold, more important than any formal education. It is the difference between life and death. At night, families huddle together on thick rugs, laid over the dirt floor. The arrangement is practical, bodies sharing warmth, breath creating a small microclimate of relative comfort. Grandparents, their bodies bent with age and cold, sit closest to the fire. Children, their small bodies generating heat like tiny furnaces, are positioned between the adults. Parents, strong and capable, form the outer ring, their bodies blocking drafts and providing protection for the more vulnerable members of the family. The grandparents tell stories, not fairy tales, but memories, of avalanches that buried entire villages, of wolves that came down from the high peaks during the harshest winters, of years when the snow never ended, when families were forced to survive on leather and boiled bones. These stories are not told to frighten, but to educate. Each tale contains lessons about survival, about reading the signs of dangerous weather, about the importance of preparation and community cooperation. The children listen with wide eyes, absorbing the wisdom along with the warmth of the fire. The stories are also history. Oral tradition preserves the memory of this place, of the people who lived and died here, of the challenges they faced, and the victories they achieved. There are stories of great storms that lasted for weeks, of brilliant summers that provided abundant harvests, of heroes who saved their villages through courage and sacrifice. There are stories of love and loss, of marriages arranged and children born, of the cycle of life that continues even in this harsh environment. Each story is a thread in the tapestry of community memory, a connection to the past that provides strength for the present. They do not cry. They do not complain. This is not stoicism, but acceptance. This is winter, and it always returns. The people of the high Himalayas understand that struggle is not something to be overcome, but something to be endured. They understand that survival is not about conquering nature, but about finding harmony with it. They understand that the mountain will always be stronger than any individual, but that the community, working together, can survive anything the mountain sends their way. The acceptance runs deeper than mere resignation. It is a profound understanding of the cycles of life and death, of the way the world works at its most fundamental level. The people here have learned to find beauty in the harsh landscape, to appreciate the subtle changes that mark the passage of seasons. They have learned to celebrate small victories, to find joy in the simple pleasure of a warm fire, a full belly, the sound of laughter echoing off the stone walls. They have learned that happiness is not the absence of suffering, but the presence of meaning, the knowledge that their lives matter, that their survival is part of something larger than themselves. The winter night deepens. Outside, the wind picks up, singing its ancient song against the stone walls. The fire crackles and whispers, its light dancing across the faces of the sleeping family. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new tests of survival. But tonight, there is warmth. Tonight, there is shelter. Tonight, there is the quiet satisfaction of another day survived, another night of safety earned, through wisdom, preparation, and the unbreakable bond of community. The mountain watches over them, impassive and eternal, as it has for thousands of years, and the people sleep, secure in the knowledge that they are part of something ancient and enduring, something that will continue long after they are gone. This is winter in the high Himalayas. This is survival distilled to its essence. This is the story of human resilience, told in the language of snow and stone, of fire and community, of the unbreakable spirit that refuses to surrender to the cold. It is a story that has been told for generations, that will be told for generations to come. It is the story of how people live when living itself becomes an act of courage. It is the story of home, found in the most unlikely places, built from the most basic elements, warmed by the most precious flames. It is the story of life, persisting against all odds, finding beauty in the struggle, discovering meaning in the very act of survival. Chapter 2. A true tale of survival and solitude. Now drift with me higher, beyond the village, past the stone homes and the yak trails, up into the coldest places where even the birds do not fly in winter. Here, where the air thins and the trees bow to the wind, there lived a man, alone. We do not know his name, Fee, we know only fragments, whispers carried down by shepherds, half-faded inscriptions carved into rock, and the silence he left behind. They call him the hermit of the peaks, a monk, a mystic, a man who left the world and survived in the mountains for nearly 30 winters. He arrived in the late 10th century when the kingdoms of the plains squabbled over land and grain. He carried nothing but a wool cloak, a clay bowl, and a small bundle of dried herbs. He said he came in search of stillness, but it was the mountains who answered him, not with peace, but with hunger and snow. His shelter was a shallow cave, facing east, cut into the side of a limestone wall. At dawn, the light would reach him. At night, the frost would claim the stone. There was no door, no firewood, no trail, just the endless conversation between wind and stone, between his breath and the thin air that carried it away. The cave itself was perhaps 10 feet wide, 6 feet deep, carved by centuries of wind and ice into the living rock. The floor was uneven limestone, polished smooth by his daily movements, by the ritual of sitting and rising, sitting and rising. Against the back wall, he had arranged a few flat stones, creating a simple altar where he placed his clay bowl, his bundle of herbs, and occasionally a handful of juniper berries when he could find them. Above the altar, scratched into the stone with a sharp fragment of quartz, were symbols, simple marks at first, growing more complex over the years. Spirals that seemed to follow the wind patterns outside, hands pressed against the rock, leaving their outline in soot and ochre, stars mapped in patterns that matched the winter sky. When the air was so clear it seemed he could reach up and pluck the light itself. He survived on lichen, scraped from boulders with a flat stone worn smooth by years of use. The lichen grew in patches of pale green and rust, bitter as medicine, tough as leather. He would soak it in melted snow, sometimes for days, until it became soft enough to chew. It provided little nourishment, but it was life, and life was sacred. Even this small, stubborn life that clung to stone in places where nothing else could grow. Roots he dug from the base of shrubs, when the ground was soft enough to yield. Wild garlic that burned his throat. Dandelion roots that grew thin and woody at this altitude. The twisted roots of juniper bushes, which he would scrape and boil into a bitter tea that warmed him from the inside. Sometimes he found the dried berries of sea buckthorn, their orange brightness like tiny suns in his palm. These he saved for the longest nights, when the cold seemed to seep into his very bones. And snow, melted in a blackened pot over a small fire, built from twisted juniper branches and dried yak dung, one mouthful at a time. The snow here was different from the snow in the valleys. Cleaner, older. It had fallen from such heights that it seemed to carry the silence of the stars themselves. He would melt it slowly, reverently, understanding that this water had traveled further than most men ever would, from the highest peaks, through clouds, through sky, into his simple pot, into his body, into his prayers. The pot itself was a marvel of endurance. Clay fired in some distant kiln, blackened by 1,000 small fires, cracked and resealed with tree sap. It had become an extension of his ritual. Every morning he would fill it with snow. Every evening he would clean it with sand and melted snow. It was perhaps the only object in his life that had changed and grown with him, acquiring its own character through use, through necessity, through the daily miracle of transforming ice into life. His days followed a rhythm as steady as breathing. Before dawn, while the stars still burned in the thin air, he would wake and sit in meditation, not the comfortable meditation of monastery cushions, but the raw meditation of stone and cold, where every breath was conscious, every heartbeat a small victory against the mountain's indifference. He would sit until the first light touched the eastern wall of his cave, painting it gold, then white, then the pale blue of high-altitude sky. With the light came movement. He would venture out to gather what the mountain offered. A handful of lichen here, a twisted root there. Sometimes he would find the frozen carcass of a small animal, a pika or mountain mouse that had not survived the night. These he would accept gratefully, understanding that death, too, was part of the mountain's generosity. He would say a prayer over the small body, thanking it for its life, for its warmth, for the brief nourishment it provided. The search for sustenance could take hours. The terrain around his cave was treacherous, loose scree that shifted underfoot, ice-covered ledges that could send a man tumbling into the void below. But he had learned to read the mountain's moods, to understand which stones would hold his weight, which paths would lead to shelter, which winds brought snow and which brought the clear, killing cold that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Sometimes he would chant. His voice, roughened by cold and thin air, would carry simple syllables into the vastness around him. Om Mani Padme Hum. The jewel in the lotus, the prayer that had sustained Buddhist practitioners for centuries, now offered to peaks that had never heard human voices, to valleys where only the wind had ever spoken. The chanting was not for gods or spirits, but for the simple human need to hear sound, to know that his voice still existed, that he was still alive in this place that seemed designed to erase all trace of human presence. Other times he would sit for days, unmoving. These were the deepest meditations, where consciousness became as thin and clear as the mountain air itself. His body would grow still, heart rate slowing, breathing becoming so shallow that snow could accumulate on his shoulders without disturbing his practice. Locals said he spoke to the sky, not with words, but with his breath and his silence. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps in those moments of complete stillness, he found a language older than words, a conversation that required no voice, only presence, only the willingness to become part of the mountain's own vast meditation. The cold was his constant companion. Not the gentle cold of lower altitudes, but the absolute cold of thin air and high stone, the cold that could kill with casual indifference. It would creep through his wool cloak, through his skin, into his bones. On the worst nights, when the wind howled through the cave like a living thing, he would practice the inner fire meditation, Tummo, the ancient technique that allows practitioners to generate heat through breath and visualization. He would imagine a flame at the base of his spine, small at first, then growing, spreading warmth through his body, like sunrise spreading across a valley. The technique required perfect concentration, complete control of breath and mind. One wandering thought, one moment of doubt, and the cold would rush back in like water through a broken dam. But when the practice worked, when the inner fire blazed steady and strong, he could sit bare-chested in temperatures that would kill an unprepared man, his skin flushed red with generated heat, steam rising from his shoulders into the frozen air. Once, a shepherd boy stumbled upon him while chasing a goat. The boy had been following a trail of hoofprints across a high meadow, calling for his lost animal, when he saw smoke rising from what he thought was an empty cave. Curious and, perhaps a little frightened, he crept closer, expecting to find bandits or wild animals. Instead he found the hermit. He was kneeling in the snow outside his cave, bare-chested, unmoving, his skin flushed red from the cold, or what the boy thought was cold. The hermit's eyes were closed, his breathing so slow it seemed he might not be breathing at all. Snow had gathered on his hair, on his eyelashes, on his shoulders. The boy thought he was dead, a frozen corpse, preserved by the mountain's cold like meat in winter storage. But then the hermit opened his eyes. Not startled, not surprised, but with the slow deliberation of someone returning from a great distance. But he looked at the boy with gentle curiosity, as if this young face was the most natural thing in the world to find in this place where nothing human should exist. And he said, softly, "You are the first voice I've heard in 4 years." The boy, terrified and fascinated in equal measure, stammered out some explanation about his goat, about the trail, about how sorry he was to disturb whatever holy work was happening here. The hermit listened with complete attention, as if every word about the lost goat was a profound teaching, a sacred text being recited for his benefit. Then he smiled, not the forced smile of social politeness, but the natural smile of genuine joy, the smile of someone who had just received an unexpected gift. "Your goat," he said, "is behind the large boulder to your left. She is eating the salt grass that grows there. She is not lost. She is exactly where she needs to be." And then, as the boy turned to look, the hermit said nothing more. The conversation was complete, perfect in its brevity, like a haiku written in breath and silence. The boy found his goat exactly where the hermit had said. As he led the animal back down the mountain, he turned once to look back at the cave. The hermit was there, still kneeling in the snow, but now his attention had returned to whatever vast conversation he had been having with the sky. The boy would tell this story for the rest of his life, but he would never return to that cave. Some encounters, he understood instinctively, are meant to happen only once. Inscriptions were found, centuries later, when a team of archaeologists explored the cave system. Simple symbols carved into the stone with primitive tools, some in ancient Tibetan script, the letters worn smooth by centuries of wind and ice. One inscription, discovered on the wall beside where his sleeping place would have been, reads, "Breathe like the wind, fast like the river, leave no mark." Others are shapes, spirals that seem to follow some cosmic pattern, hands pressed against the rock and traced in soot, stars mapped in configurations that match no earthly constellation. These later inscriptions suggest a mind that had moved beyond ordinary human concerns, into territories of consciousness that have no names in any language. They are not the desperate scratchings of a man going mad in isolation, but the careful, deliberate marks of someone recording discoveries, mapping territories of the spirit that can only be explored in the deepest solitude. Oral legends tell of a leopard who sat beside him each winter. The great cat, normally the most solitary of predators, would appear with the first snowfall and take up residence on a ledge just outside the cave, never approaching, never threatening, but present, like a guardian appointed by the mountain itself. Shepherds claim to have seen them together, man and beast in perfect stillness, neither hunter nor hunted, simply two forms of life that had found a way to exist in harmony with the stone and ice around them. Other stories speak of birds who brought him berries. Ravens, with their intelligence and their disregard for human conventions, supposedly understood his need. They would arrive carrying sea buckthorn berries, juniper berries, even small nuts from lower altitudes. A single berry placed carefully on the stone beside his cave, like an offering, like a gift from the sky itself. The hermit would receive these offerings with the same reverence he brought to everything, understanding that in a place where survival was measured in calories and degrees of body heat, such gifts were literally the difference between life and death. There are tales of spirits who listened to his prayers through the ice, voices that answered his chants with echoes that came from no earthly source. Lights that danced around his cave on the clearest nights, not the aurora, which does not appear at these latitudes, but something else, something that belonged to the mountain alone. Old women in the villages below still speak of these lights, still warn their children not to follow them if they appear, for they lead only to places where humans are not meant to go. Of course, these are only stories, but stories too are a kind of truth. They tell us not necessarily what happened, but what people needed to believe had happened. They reveal the human hunger for magic, for proof that consciousness can transcend the ordinary limits of flesh and blood. They speak to our deepest hope, that dedication, that complete surrender to a spiritual practice, can transform a human being into something that partakes of the eternal, something that can survive in places where survival should be impossible. What we know for certain is this. When a merchant caravan passed through the region in the late 11th century, they were led to his cave by a local boy. The same boy, now grown old, who had encountered the hermit decades earlier. He had carried the memory of that frozen figure all his life. And when the merchants asked about holy sites in the area, about caves where prayers might have special power, he led them up the treacherous path to the limestone cliff. There, they found only bones, wrapped neatly in wool that had somehow survived the decades, arranged in the lotus position of meditation. The skeleton sat facing east, toward the morning light, as if still waiting for dawn. The bones were clean, picked spotless by the mountain's careful processes of decay and renewal. No violence, no struggle, simply the quiet ending that comes to all flesh, the final meditation that requires no breath, no consciousness, only the willingness to become part of the stone and sky that had sustained him for so long. Around him, his clay bowl, cracked but still recognizable, a stone with a groove worn smooth by years of sharpening roots, of preparing the mountain's meager offerings for consumption, and most remarkably, a single, unburned stick of incense, Tibetan incense, made from juniper and rhododendron, substances that grew hundreds of miles away in more temperate valleys. How it had come to be there, how it had survived the decades of wind and weather, no one could explain. But there it was, perfect and unused, as if he had been saving it for some special occasion that never came, or perhaps for the moment when visitors would finally arrive to witness his completion. The merchants, moved by what they had found, left offerings of their own. Butter tea poured onto the stone, barley flour scattered to the wind, silk scarves tied to the juniper bushes that grew near the cave entrance. They understood, without needing explanation, that they were in the presence of something extraordinary. A man who had achieved what every spiritual seeker dreams of, the complete transcendence of ordinary human limitations. Death had come to him, not as enemy or tragedy, but as the natural completion of a practice that had already carried him beyond the boundaries of normal existence. The hermit had passed, just as he had lived, quietly, alone, and entirely at peace with the mountain. His bones, when they were finally collected and taken to a monastery in the valley below, were said to be unusually light, as if the years of meditation had refined even his physical form, removing everything unnecessary, everything that was not etinous to the pure practice of awareness itself. The cave remains. Pilgrims still visit it, though the path is treacherous and the altitude challenges even experienced climbers. They come seeking blessings, seeking proof that human consciousness can indeed transcend the ordinary limits of flesh and circumstance. They leave offerings, small things mostly. A handful of barley, a piece of cloth, a whispered prayer that joins the mountain's vast silence. And sometimes, on the clearest nights, they report seeing lights around the cave. Not the harsh light of human fires, but something softer, more diffuse, something that seems to rise from the stone itself, as if the hermit's long practice had left a mark on the very molecules of the place. As if consciousness, once refined to its essence, becomes part of the mountain's own eternal meditation. His story spreads slowly, carried by shepherds and traders, by pilgrims and wanderers. It changes in the telling, as all stories do. Details are added, miracles are embellished, the man becomes legend, and legend becomes teaching, but at its heart, the story remains simple. A human being, who chose the hardest possible path to enlightenment, who embraced solitude so complete, it bordered on erasure, who found in the mountain's harsh indifference, not an enemy, but a teacher of perfect honesty, and who discovered, in the end, that the boundary between human consciousness and the vast awareness of stone and sky and wind is far more porous than most of us dare to imagine. In the villages below, mothers still tell their children about the hermit of the peaks. Not as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder of what human dedication can achieve when it is absolute, when winter storms howl through the valleys, when the cold seems unbearable and the darkness endless. They remember the man who made such conditions his daily practice, who found in them not obstacles, but opportunities, who proved through the simple act of continuing to breathe, to sit, to be present, that consciousness itself is more durable than any of the circumstances that seem to threaten it. And sometimes, on the clearest winter nights, when the stars burn like diamonds in the thin air, the children ask if the hermit is still up there, still sitting, still breathing with the wind and fasting with the river, still leaving no mark except the profound mark of a life lived in complete accordance with its deepest truth. The mothers smile, understanding that some questions have no answers, or rather, that the answer lies not in words, but in the vast silence that surrounds all words, in the space between heartbeats, in the pause between breaths, in the eternal moment where human consciousness touches the infinite patience of stone and sky, and discovers, in that touching, that they were never separate at all. Chapter 3. The Hidden History of Himalayan Sanctuaries. Now, let us step deeper still, not into caves, but into time itself. Beneath the eternal snow, beneath layers of silence and forgotten breath, lie the skeletons of stories. Temples swallowed by glaciers, gods buried in ice, and rituals that waited centuries to be seen again. There are places in the Himalayas where no roads go, only wind, snow, and memory. High above 16,000 feet, at the edge of a glacial lake known as Rupkund, something waits under the ice. This is not merely a body of water, but a chronicle written in bone, a testament to the mountain's hunger for human stories. The lake sits like a cold eye, reflecting nothing but sky and the scattered remains of those who came before. Discovered by accident in 1942 by a British forest ranger named H.K. Madwal, this frozen lake revealed a secret that would perplex scientists for generations. Hundreds of human skeletons scattered across the shore like seeds waiting for a spring that would never come, bones white and brittle, some still wearing jewelry that caught the high-altitude sun, some with cracked skulls bearing witness to violence from above, some lying face down, arms folded, as if praying to gods who had turned their faces away. For decades, No one knew who they were. Theories whispered through the mountains like prayer flags in the wind. Were they invaders? Lost armies seeking passage through impossible terrain? A cursed pilgrimage? Devotees who had angered some mountain deity? An ancient caravan? Merchants carrying silk and spices caught in nature's trap? Each theory carried its own weight of mystery, its own invitation to wonder at the stories that die with their tellers. The bones themselves told fragments of truth. Carbon dating revealed deaths, spanning centuries, not a single catastrophic event, but multiple tragedies played out across time. The study finds that the two major genetic groups were actually deposited approximately 1,000 years apart. First, during the 7th–10th centuries CE, individuals with Indian-related ancestry died at Rupkund, possibly during several distinct events. This was not one story, but many stories, all ending in the same cold silence. Recent studies reveal something even more extraordinary. A group of 23 individuals have ancestry that falls within the range of variation of present-day South Asians. A further 14 have ancestry typical of the Eastern Mediterranean. Among the scattered bones, researchers found traces of people who had traveled impossible distances. The later group, who arrived at Rupkund around 1800, had a genetic ancestry tied to the Mediterranean, Greece and Crete, to be exact, Greeks and Cretans, their bones mingling with those of local pilgrims in the democracy of death. What brought Mediterranean peoples to this remote lake? What pilgrimage or purpose could justify such a journey through hostile terrain? The mountains keep their secrets, but the bones whisper of connections we can barely imagine, to trade routes that spanned continents, spiritual quests that transcended borders, human restlessness that found no boundary too high, no distance too far. Many of these ancient travelers, it seems, were killed by the sky itself. Massive hailstones, some the size of cricket balls, struck their skulls with deadly force during freak storms that appear in these heights with little warning. When a team from National Geographic retrieved about 30 skeletons in 2003, flesh was still attached to some of them. The cold had preserved not just bone, but skin and tissue, maintaining the appearance of recent death across centuries of time. A freak storm, a tragic march. And the lake, like a glass mirror, kept them frozen in time, their stories locked in ice, until modern science could begin to read the fragments. The irony was not lost on local guides who had always known these bones existed. They had simply never asked the questions that science demanded. But Rupkund is not alone in its keeping of secrets. Scattered across the range are shrines, hidden for centuries, revealed only when glaciers retreat, when permafrost softens, when the mountain briefly opens its hand to show what lies beneath. Climate change, that great revealer of buried truths, has become an inadvertent archaeologist, uncovering what was meant to stay hidden. Moss-covered idols emerge from snowdrifts, like sleepers waking from long dreams, some made of stone, others of wood, preserved in the cold, like ancient amber holding insects from forgotten summers. Faces smoothed by ice, eyes once painted with ash and blood, now faded to soft hollows that seem to watch visitors with the patience of eternity itself. 10,000 man-made caves have been tunneled through the rock in the Himalayan regions, creating a network of spiritual retreat spaces that predates most known civilizations. These caves, many carved by hand over generations, served as meditation chambers, storage for sacred texts, and refuge for those seeking communion with the divine through isolation and hardship. Who were these gods that waited so patiently under snow? Some are known, ancient manifestations of Shiva, Durga, and local guardian spirits whose names echo in valley dialects that fewer people speak each year. Others remain unnamed. Mouthless masks carved from local stone, serpent-bodied beings whose symbolism died with their creators. Offerings lie around their feet like forgotten prayers, beads of bone and metal, fragments of horn, dried rice sealed in earthenware jars that somehow survived centuries of freeze and thaw. One temple, discovered at over 13,500 feet, was found with its doorway still intact despite avalanches and rockfall that should have destroyed such delicate architecture centuries ago. Inside, walls painted with faded murals of sky chariots and glowing suns, celestial vehicles that carried souls between earth and heaven. There was no roof, just open sky, stars that would have been visible even during daylight at such altitude. Perhaps it had always been that way. A temple meant not to protect from the heavens, but to invite them in. The architects understood something about proximity to the divine that builders at lower elevations could never grasp. At such heights, the boundary between earth and sky becomes meaningless. The air itself becomes prayer. Archaeological evidence suggests that many of these high-altitude sacred sites were connected by pilgrimage routes that remained active for centuries, even millennia. Each year it witnesses thousands of devotees flocking for worship in a hope to receive salvation. The Temple of Muktinath is in the Annapurna region, at an altitude of 300 meters from the sea level. These paths, worn smooth by the feet of countless seekers, created a spiritual geography that mapped the relationship between human devotion and natural obstacle. Many of these sites are part of pilgrimage routes walked even today. Not for tourists seeking photo opportunities, not for cameras hungry for exotic imagery, but for those who remember, who light butter lamps and leave behind coins, songs or whispers that the wind carries to places human voices could never reach alone. These modern pilgrims often report finding artifacts, small carved figures or metal ritual implements, that they leave untouched as offerings to whoever might need them next. The rituals of the cold are not loud. There are no drums echoing off canyon walls, no bright cloth fluttering like captured birds, only breath visible on the wind, and the soft chime of bells, strung in prayer across frozen passes where the air itself rings with each footstep. The sound carries for miles in the thin atmosphere, creating involuntary music from the simple act of walking. Death and worship here are not opposites. They share the same silence, the same snow, the same understanding that human presence in such places is always temporary. And perhaps, in some locations where the wind carves prayers from stone and the cold preserves intention across centuries, they are one and the same thing, different aspects of surrender to forces greater than individual will. The archaeological record speaks of ritualized exposure of the dead, sky burial practices where human remains were deliberately left for scavengers and weather. This was not abandonment, but consecration, returning the temporary vessel of the body to the elements that had created it. Bones found at various high-altitude sites show evidence of this practice, with cut marks indicating careful preparation of remains for ceremonial purposes. Local folklore, passed down through generations of valley dwellers, tells of shrine keepers who lived year-round at impossible altitudes, tending sacred fires that could never be allowed to die. These guardians, often single individuals who had taken vows of solitude, maintained the spiritual infrastructure that made pilgrimage possible for others. Their bones, when found, are often discovered near altar stones and ritual implements, suggesting they died at their posts rather than abandon their sacred duties. Stone circles found near several temple sites indicate astronomical observation practices, alignments with solstices and equinoxes that allowed precise calculation of ceremonial timing. The builders understood that certain rituals required specific celestial conditions, that the relationship between earth and sky demanded attention to cosmic rhythms. These astronomical markers often incorporated local stone types quarried from locations that were themselves considered sacred. Inscriptions carved into cave walls discovered only when centuries of ice finally melted reveal prayers in scripts that predate known writing systems in the region. Some appear to be pictographic, others use symbols that suggest influence from distant cultures, traders and spiritual seekers who carried not just goods but ideas across impossible terrain. The preservation of these texts in the dry cold of high-altitude caves has created an accidental library, a collection of spiritual literature that survived because it was forgotten. Water sources near many of these sites show evidence of artificial modification. Springs that were channeled and contained to create sacred pools for ritual ablution. The engineering required to maintain flowing water at such altitudes where freezing would destroy most construction suggests sophisticated understanding of hydraulics and seasonal temperature variation. These pools, when discovered, often contain votive offerings, small metal figures thrown into the water as prayers for safe passage or spiritual blessing. The textiles found at some sites, preserved by cold and dryness, reveal weaving techniques and dye processes that indicate trade connections spanning thousands of miles. Silk threads that could only have originated in China, colors derived from plants that grew in much warmer climates, all incorporated into prayer flags and ritual garments found at altitudes where such materials should never have existed. The dedication required to transport such items, suggest religious purposes that transcended practical concerns. Evidence of metal working at several high-altitude sites indicates that some sacred objects were created on location, rather than transported from workshops in the valleys below. To copper and bronze implements, forged using techniques that required intimate knowledge of how metals behave in thin air and extreme cold, demonstrate that religious devotion drove technological innovation in impossible places. The furnaces needed for such work would have consumed enormous quantities of fuel, requiring supply chains that functioned across vertical miles of terrain. Botanical remains found in sealed containers at shrine sites reveal the cultivation of medicinal and psychoactive plants, species that were not native to high-altitude environments. These plants, some with properties that alter consciousness, suggest ritual practices that sought to induce visionary states as part of spiritual discipline. The preservation techniques used to maintain these plants across seasons when fresh growth was impossible indicate sophisticated knowledge of preparation and storage methods. Bone tools found alongside human remains show modification patterns consistent with self-mortification practices, deliberate infliction of pain as spiritual discipline. These implements, carefully crafted and polished through use, suggest that physical suffering was understood as a pathway to transcendent experience. The care taken in their creation indicates that such practices were not spontaneous, but institutionalized, part of established spiritual traditions that required specific tools and techniques. Animal remains at various sites, particularly those of high-altitude adapted species like snow leopards and blue sheep, show butchering patterns that suggest ritual consumption rather than simple sustenance. Certain bones were preserved as ritual objects, others arranged in patterns that mirror astronomical configurations found in stone circles at the same locations. The relationship between spiritual practice and the consumption of animals that shared the harsh environment creates a portrait of religious systems that incorporated the full spectrum of high-altitude existence. Geological analysis of shrine construction reveals transportation of building materials across distances that would challenge modern logistics. Stones carried from specific quarries, selected not just for practical properties but for symbolic significance, moved along routes that no longer exist or remain known only to local guides whose knowledge passes from father to son. The effort required to build permanent structures at such elevations, using materials that had to be carried by human strength alone, demonstrates commitment that transcended rational calculation. Weather patterns recorded in ice cores from glaciers near several temple sites indicate that construction and major renovation activities were timed to coincide with relatively stable climatic periods. The builders understood seasonal and longer-term weather cycles, planning their work during windows of opportunity that might last only a few years per century. This suggests not just spiritual motivation but sophisticated environmental knowledge, the ability to read natural signs and plan accordingly across generational timescales. The isolation of these sites created unique preservation conditions, but also ensured that many secrets died with their keepers. Knowledge that was never written down because literacy was not assumed. Ritual procedures that were learned through observation and practice rather than instruction, all lost when the last practitioner died without finding a suitable successor. The archaeological record captures only fragments, the material remains of spiritual systems whose living practice remains forever beyond recovery. Modern pilgrims who visit these rediscovered sites often report experiences that transcend simple tourism, encounters with presence or energy that suggest the spiritual power of these locations was not entirely dependent on human maintenance. The mountains themselves, according to local belief, retain the prayers and intentions that were offered across centuries, creating reservoirs of sacred power that persist even when the traditions that created them have been forgotten. Whether such experiences reflect objective spiritual reality or subjective response to profound isolation and physical challenge, the consistency of reports suggests that these places continue to function as intended by their builders. The future of these archaeological treasures remains uncertain. Climate change that reveals buried sites also threatens their preservation, as increased temperature variation and precipitation patterns accelerate the weathering processes that cold had slowed for centuries. The documentation efforts race against time, attempting to record what can be learned before it is lost forever to the same natural forces that preserved it. The irony is inescapable, that the conditions which protected these remnants of ancient spiritual practice are disappearing faster than they can be studied. Yet something in these discoveries speaks to continuities that transcend individual sites or specific religious traditions. The human impulse to seek the sacred in difficult places, to find meaning through hardship, to leave traces of devotion in locations where survival itself requires constant attention. These impulses, evidenced in bones and stones and prayer flags that flutter in wind that recognizes no borders, suggest that the relationship between spiritual seeking and physical challenge may be as fundamental to human nature as the need for shelter and sustenance. In the end, the temples and shrines, emerging from Himalayan ice, speak not just of past devotion, but of present possibility. They remind us that people have always been willing to go further, climb higher, risk more, in pursuit of experiences that rationality alone cannot justify. The mountains keep their secrets, but they also offer their gifts to those who are willing to meet them on their own terms, in their own time, with the patience that high places demand, and the reverence that thin air teaches to all who breathe it. Life among Himalayan nobles. Not everyone who lived in the shadow of the Himalayas suffered equally. While most endured winter with cracked hands, simple porridge, and the constant gnawing of cold through thin walls, some lived behind heavy doors carved from cedar, surrounded by wealth that came not from gold or silver gleaming in distant lands, but from the ancient treasures of the mountains themselves: wool, salt, and honey. These were the nobles of the mountains, the aristocrats of ice and stone, landholders whose ancestry stretched back through generations of wind and snow, high lamas, whose spiritual authority commanded both reverence and material tribute, caravan lords, who controlled the precious flow of goods across impossible passes, and descendants of warriors who had once carved kingdoms from the frozen peaks themselves. Some traced their bloodlines to the ancient Tibetan Empire, others to the regional dynasties that rose from the ashes of that great collapse in the 9th century. There were three main feudal social groups in Tibet prior to 1959, namely ordinary lay people, Misa in Tibetan, lay nobility, Sigapa, and monks. Their homes were larger than the cramped dwellings of common folk, yet not palaces in the manner of lowland kingdoms. These were fortified houses, structures built to withstand both the fury of mountain storms and the occasional raid from neighboring valleys. Often perched on hillsides like great stone eagles surveying their domain, these residences commanded views across valleys where mist clung to terraced fields, and where prayer flags fluttered like captured pieces of sky against the stark landscape. The walls were thick, built from local stone fitted with such precision that wind could not find purchase in the cracks, designed to keep out not just the bitter cold, but also the wolves that still roamed the high places in those days. Inside these mountain strongholds, wealth revealed itself in ways that would have seemed foreign to nobles of warmer lands. Painted ceilings stretched overhead, decorated with intricate mandalas and sacred symbols that seemed to move in the flickering light of butter lamps. The pigments came from distant places: lapis lazuli ground to powder for the deepest blues, cinnabar for reds that glowed like captured fire, gold leaf applied with brushes made from the finest yak hair. Embroidered wall hangings covered the stone walls, tapestries woven by skilled artisans whose fingers knew the ancient patterns passed down through generations. Dragons and phoenixes danced across silk threads, while geometric designs spoke of Buddhist cosmology and the eternal cycle of existence. Large chests, carved from cedar and juniper, that grew in the protected valleys below, held the real treasures of these highland aristocrats. Saffron lay in small silk pouches, each thread worth more than a common family might see in a season, brought from the distant fields of Kashmir, through trade networks that spanned the entire roof of the world. Dried apricots and apples, preserved from the brief mountain summers, provided sweetness during the long months when fresh fruit became only a memory. Incense-filled wooden boxes, sandalwood and juniper, frankincense and myrrh, creating fragrances that could transform a stone room into a temple. Fine cloth occupied entire chests, silk from China and cotton from India, wool so finely spun it felt like captured cloud between the fingers. They drank butter tea, like everyone in these highlands, but theirs was made with sweeter butter, churned longer, from the milk of their own herds, spiced with cardamom, brought up ancient trade routes, and flavored with salt that came from sacred lakes high in the Tibetan plateau. The Tibet-Nepal salt trade route is an ancient salt trading route, running between the Tibetan plateau and the middle hills of Nepal and further on to India. The tea was served in delicate porcelain cups, Chinese ceramics that had traveled for months across mountain passes, or in silver vessels worked by craftsmen whose skills were as treasured as the precious metal itself. The ritual of tea became ceremony, each cup poured with intention, each sip connecting the drinker to the vast network of trade and culture that stretched across the mountains. They burned incense not merely for warmth, as the common folk might burn whatever wood they could find, but for ritual and spiritual purpose. The smoke rose in patterns that seemed to carry prayers directly to the heavens, wafting through rooms where sacred texts lay open on carved wooden stands. And in winter, while common folk spent their evenings patching their worn shoes with whatever scraps they could find, these households held elaborate ceremonies that could stretch for days. The feasts were legendary, not just for their abundance, but for their artistry. Long tables appeared, sometimes improvised from planks, laid across carved supports, sometimes permanent fixtures of polished wood that had taken craftsmen months to complete. The meals themselves were fragrant with spices that most mountain dwellers only encountered in dreams. Yak meat prepared with techniques passed down through generations, seasoned with herbs that grew wild in hidden valleys, cooked in copper pots that gleamed like captured sunlight. Rice came from the lower valleys, each grain precious, prepared with such care that it seemed to glow with its own inner light. Vegetables preserved in salt and oil provided colors that brightened the grey months of winter, while dairy products, cheese aged in caves and yogurt thick as cream, offered richness that could sustain a person through the coldest nights. Singers performed during these feasts, their voices carrying oral epics that stretched back centuries. They told stories of gods who walked among the peaks, of lovers separated by avalanches and reunited by divine intervention, of kings who could speak the language of eagles and who ruled kingdoms that touched the very roof of heaven. The melodies seemed to echo the mountain winds themselves, rising and falling like the passes that connected valley to valley. The musicians played instruments crafted specifically for the thin air of high altitude, their sounds carrying further in the crisp mountain atmosphere, creating harmonies that seemed to merge with the natural symphony of wind and water. The floors of these great rooms were covered in layered carpets, rugs woven with patterns that told stories, some depicting the Buddhist wheel of life, others showing scenes from local legends. In one corner, musicians would gather with their instruments, stringed lyres and hand drums, wooden flutes that could mimic the call of mountain birds. In another corner, monks sat cross-legged, invited not as guests but as essential participants, their presence blessing the season with slow chants that seemed to make the very stones of the house vibrate with spiritual energy. The rhythms of their prayers became the heartbeat of the household, connecting the domestic sphere to the cosmic order that governed all existence. Children in these households played with carved toys that were works of art in themselves. Wooden horses painted with intricate designs, dolls dressed in miniature versions of adult clothing, games carved from ivory and bone that taught strategy and patience. They learned not just to read and write, skills rare in the mountains, but to understand the complex social networks that sustained their elevated position. Dogs roamed freely through these homes, great mastiffs with coats thick enough to withstand the mountain cold, bred for both protection and companionship, their presence adding warmth and life to rooms that might otherwise feel cavernous in the long winter months. Some families maintained sacred animals, creatures set apart from the ordinary livestock that provided milk and meat. Snow-white goats with coats like spun silk, their fleece worth small fortunes to those who knew its value. Birds with symbolic markings, hawks and ravens that were believed to carry messages between the earthly and divine realms. These animals were never killed, never sold, only watched and honored, and whispered to on days deemed auspicious by the lunar calendar. They represented the family's connection to the spiritual world, living symbols of prosperity that required constant care and attention. Children learned to tend these creatures as part of their education, understanding that wealth came with responsibility, that privilege demanded service to powers greater than human ambition. These nobles did not mine their wealth from the ground like the merchants of other lands. Their fortunes moved, flowing along ancient routes that connected the high plateau of Tibet to the markets of India, Nepal, and beyond. Caravans of yaks, camels, and horses traversed these routes, laden with goods such as Chinese silk, Indian spices, and Tibetan wool. Caravans became the arteries of their economic system, long trains of laden animals that could stretch for miles across the landscape, loaded with salt from the sacred lakes of the Tibetan plateau, honey from the forested valleys where bees somehow survived the mountain winters, and wool spun by village women whose spinning wheels sang soft songs through the long mountain nights. The salt was perhaps the most precious cargo, white crystals that formed naturally in the high lakes where no fish could survive, but where minerals concentrated into treasures more valuable than silver. Salt from natural deposits in the Himalayas was transported through mountainous terrain to supply Tibetan communities, fostering economic ties and cultural exchanges. The honey came from valleys that seemed touched by magic, where wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion during the brief summer months, producing nectar with flavors that carried hints of the mountain herbs and clean air. The wool represented the finest work of human hands, fleece sorted by color and texture, spun into thread so fine it could be woven into cloth that rivaled silk for softness, while surpassing it in warmth. These caravans crossed high-altitude passes that would challenge modern mountaineers, routes that existed only because generations of traders had worn paths into the stone itself. The journeys could take weeks, sometimes months, depending on weather and the political situation in the various kingdoms and principalities through which the routes passed. The silence was profound at those heights, broken only by the soft jangle of harness bells that had been blessed by lamas, the rhythmic crunch of hooves on snow and gravel, and the occasional call of traders encouraging their animals forward across landscapes that seemed to exist at the very edge of the world. The nobles who controlled these routes managed far more than simple commerce. They protected the caravans from bandits who sometimes haunted the high passes, providing escorts of armed horsemen when the cargo was particularly valuable. They negotiated safe passage through territories controlled by other rulers, maintaining the complex diplomatic relationships that kept trade flowing even when political tensions ran high. They taxed the goods that passed through their domains, but not excessively, understanding that their prosperity depended on maintaining the economic networks that connected the isolated mountain communities to the wider world. With wealth came influence that extended far beyond mere economic power. In many valleys, the line between spiritual and political authority blurred, until it became impossible to say where one ended and the other began. And high lamas ruled not just temples and monasteries but entire districts, their word carrying the weight of divine command. And throughout much of Tibetan history, many of the great monasteries were controlled by aristocratic abbots, who were able to marry and pass along their monastic possessions to their sons. Secular nobles often held religious titles as well, their authority drawing from both their material resources and their perceived spiritual merit. The system created a web of relationships that bound communities together across vast distances, uniting valleys that might otherwise have remained isolated from one another. Their authority was quiet but deep, expressed not through dramatic proclamations, but through subtle influence that shaped the rhythm of daily life. They decided when the spring planting could begin, reading signs in weather patterns, and consulting with astrologers who tracked the movement of stars across the clear mountain sky. That when someone died, they determined whether the body could be cremated or whether sky burial was more appropriate, based on complex calculations involving the deceased's karma, the family's status, and the astronomical conditions at the time of death. Marriage permissions flowed through their hands, as they evaluated not just the compatibility of potential partners, but the impact such unions might have on the social fabric of their communities. In many of these noble households, books were treasured possessions, manuscripts copied by hand with inks made from minerals and plants, written on paper, crafted from the inner bark of certain trees that grew in protected groves. These texts were wrapped in cloth, blessed by high lamas, stored in cedar shelves that were built into the very structure of the house, kept away from dampness that could destroy in a single season what had taken months or years to create. The libraries contained Buddhist scriptures, philosophical treatises, historical chronicles, medical texts, and poetic works, creating repositories of knowledge that served entire regions. The elite did not merely live well by mountain standards. They served as guardians of culture, preserving songs that might otherwise have been lost, maintaining traditions that connected present communities to their ancient roots. They sponsored festivals that brought together people from multiple valleys, funding elaborate celebrations that could last for weeks, providing food and entertainment for thousands of participants. They supported artisans whose skills produced the beautiful objects that filled their homes, metal workers and weavers, painters and carvers, musicians and poets. They kept time not just by the solar calendar, but by prayer wheels and ritual observances that marked the spiritual progression of the year alongside its astronomical cycles. Scribes working in these households produced copies of important texts, ensuring that knowledge could survive the destruction that periodically swept through the mountains. Wars between neighboring kingdoms, natural disasters, fires that could consume entire libraries, all threatened the accumulated wisdom of centuries. By maintaining multiple copies in different locations, these noble families created a distributed network of preservation that could survive localized catastrophes. The work was slow and painstaking, each character formed with deliberate care, each page a small work of art in itself. Illuminated manuscripts blazed with gold and bright pigments, their margins decorated with intricate designs that transformed functional documents into objects of beauty. The education of children in these households extended far beyond basic literacy. They learned multiple languages, necessary for conducting trade across regions where different dialects and scripts were used. They studied astronomy and astrology, understanding the movements of celestial bodies that influenced everything from agricultural timing to spiritual practice. They memorized genealogies that could stretch back dozens of generations, oral histories that preserved the political alliances and family connections that shaped regional power structures. They practiced calligraphy until their brushstrokes could create characters that were themselves works of art, developing the kind of refined skill that marked true aristocracy in mountain society. Musical education was considered essential, not merely for entertainment but as a form of spiritual discipline. Young nobles learned to play instruments that were often unique to their region, developing skills that could provide solace during the long winter months, while also serving diplomatic functions when hosting visitors from other territories. Singing was equally important. Voices trained to perform the epic ballads that preserved historical memory, songs that could last for hours, and required both exceptional vocal skill and prodigious memory to perform correctly. Yet even these families, with their spices and tapestries, their libraries and sacred animals, their connections to distant lands, and their influence over local affairs, could not entirely banish the fundamental reality of mountain existence. The cold touched everyone, regardless of social status, creeping through even the thickest walls during the deepest winter nights. They too listened for changes in the wind that might signal approaching storms, watched the sky for signs that could mean the difference between safe travel and disaster. They too measured their firewood with careful attention, understanding that even great wealth could not conjure fuel from empty air, that survival at altitude required constant vigilance regardless of one's position in society. When the snow fell heavy, transforming familiar landscapes into alien terrain, when passes became impassable and communication with the outside world ceased entirely, these noble families gathered in their finest rooms, spaces made warm by accumulated wealth, but still dim with the soft light of butter lamps. The flames flickered against walls decorated with centuries of artistic achievement, casting shadows that seemed to dance with the painted figures on ceiling and tapestry. Family members sat close together, their fine robes insufficient against the kind of cold that seemed to seep up from the very bones of the earth, waiting for spring with the same mixture of patience and anxiety that affected every human being who had chosen to make their life in these impossible heights. The waiting became its own ritual, time marked not by clocks, which would freeze in such conditions, but by the rhythm of prayers and the gradual consumption of stored supplies. Stories were told and retold, family histories that connected present challenges to past triumphs, epic tales that reminded listeners of the heroes who had faced similar trials and emerged victorious. Music provided comfort, melodies that seemed to hold the promise of warmer days, harmonies that created a sense of community even when the outside world had disappeared entirely behind walls of wind and snow. Children born into these privileged circumstances learned early that their advantages came with expectations. They would inherit not just wealth, but responsibility, becoming guardians of traditions that connected their communities to something larger than mere survival. They would be expected to show generosity to those less fortunate, to use their resources in ways that benefited the wider society, to maintain the complex networks of relationship and obligation that kept mountain civilization functioning despite its apparent fragility. The young nobles studied maps that showed trade routes stretching across impossible terrain, learning to navigate not just geographical challenges but political complexities that could shift with each new season. They memorized the names and characteristics of important families in distant valleys, understanding that their own prosperity depended on maintaining good relationships with people they might meet only a few times in their entire lives. They learned to evaluate the quality of goods that formed the basis of their wealth, developing the kind of expertise that could distinguish between ordinary salt and the premium crystals that commanded the highest prices in distant markets. Training in diplomacy began early. As children observed the subtle negotiations that characterized interactions between different levels of mountain society, they watched how their parents handled disputes between trading partners, how agreements were reached when different communities had competing claims to scarce resources, how marriages were arranged not just for personal compatibility, but for the political and economic advantages they might bring to extended family networks. The skills required were subtle, involving an understanding of human psychology that went far beyond simple business calculations. Religious education was equally important, as spiritual authority often provided the foundation for secular power. Young nobles learned to perform the rituals that marked important occasions, understanding that their ability to connect earthly concerns with divine will would influence their effectiveness as leaders. They studied Buddhist philosophy, not just as abstract doctrine, but as practical guidance for making the kind of complex decisions that came with high social position. They learned to mediate disputes by appealing to shared spiritual values, using religious concepts to create solutions that might not emerge from purely practical negotiation. The cultivation of artistic sensibility was considered essential for anyone who would inhabit the upper levels of mountain society. Young people learned to appreciate the subtle differences between objects that might appear similar to untrained eyes, developing the kind of refined taste that could distinguish between competent craftsmanship and truly exceptional work. They practiced various art forms themselves, not necessarily with the intention of becoming professional artists, but to gain the deep understanding that came only through personal experience with creative challenges. Physical training remained important even for the privileged, as mountain life demanded strength and endurance regardless of social status. Young nobles learned to ride horses and yaks across difficult terrain, to handle weapons that might be needed for protection during trading expeditions, to endure the physical hardships that came with travel at high altitude. They participated in hunting expeditions that served both practical and social functions, providing meat for important feasts while also creating opportunities for the kind of bonding that strengthened political alliances. As winter deepened and the outside world contracted to the boundaries of their fortified homes, these noble families created islands of warmth and culture that sustained entire regions through the darkest months. Their libraries became centers of learning, where scholars could work on projects that required access to rare texts. Their kitchens produced feasts that provided not just nutrition, but spiritual sustenance, meals that reminded people of abundance even when scarcity threatened. Their halls hosted gatherings where musicians and poets could share their latest compositions, where young people could meet potential partners, where the complex social negotiations that governed mountain society could proceed despite the isolation imposed by weather. The influence of these aristocratic households extended beyond their immediate geographical boundaries through networks of kinship and alliance that connected valleys across vast distances. A marriage arranged in one location might have implications for trade relationships hundreds of miles away. A religious ceremony sponsored by one family might attract participants from communities that were normally isolated from each other, creating opportunities for cultural exchange that enriched everyone involved. Letters carried by trusted messengers maintained communication between noble houses, even when regular travel became impossible, preserving the social connections that gave meaning and structure to mountain existence. Yet, the ultimate reality remained unchanged by all this wealth and influence. In the Himalayas, survival depended ultimately not on human institutions, but on the mercy of forces that dwelt beyond human control. The mountains themselves were the final arbiters, determining which passes would remain open, which communities would be cut off by avalanches, which valleys would receive enough snowmelt to sustain their crops through another growing season. Even the most powerful noble families lived as guests in a landscape that could withdraw its hospitality without warning, reducing centuries of accumulated advantage to nothing in a single catastrophic season. This knowledge created a particular kind of humility among mountain aristocrats, an understanding that their privilege existed only within the narrow parameters that the natural world allowed. Their wealth was not a shield against disaster, but a responsibility to use available resources wisely, to make decisions that took into account not just immediate advantage but long-term sustainability. They became students of weather patterns and natural cycles, understanding that their survival and that of their communities depended on reading the subtle signs that indicated changes in the mountain's mood. The relationship between human ambition and natural constraint created a distinctive form of mountain civilization, one that valued continuity over innovation, stability over growth, adaptation over conquest. The noble families who prospered in this environment were those who learned to work within natural limits rather than against them, who understood that true wealth came not from accumulating resources, but from maintaining the relationships that made prosperity possible in such a challenging environment. Their legacy was not measured in monuments that proclaimed their power, but in the survival of the communities they served, in the preservation of knowledge and traditions that might otherwise have been lost, in the maintenance of trade networks that connected isolated populations to the wider world. They lived as bridges between the human and natural worlds, translating the demands of geography into social institutions, creating forms of civilization that could flourish even in places where survival itself required constant vigilance and extraordinary skill. Because in the Himalayas, no one, regardless of wealth or status or spiritual attainment, lives without the mountain's permission. The peaks grant that permission day by day, season by season, sometimes withdrawing it without warning, reminding every human inhabitant that all earthly power remains ultimately subject to forces that dwarf human understanding. The nobles of these heights understood this truth more deeply than most, having learned through generations of experience that true wisdom lay not in conquering the mountains, but in finding ways to live gracefully within their shadow, accepting the gifts they offered while respecting the limits they imposed, building forms of wealth and culture that could endure the endless cycle of seasons that defined existence at the roof of the world. And so, our journey comes to a quiet end. We've walked through villages where breath became smoke, met a man who vanished into the wind, stepped through temples buried in ice, and glimpsed lives of warmth amid the cold. The Himalayas are not just mountains, they are keepers. Keepers of stories too quiet for books, keepers of rituals carved into frozen stone, keepers of the simple, sacred act of enduring. And, as we return now to our soft beds, our humming heaters, our rooms not made of mud or yak wool, perhaps something lingers, a reverence maybe, for the silence between storms, for the fire that never sleeps, for the lives built in the hardest places, not for glory, but because they had to be. Let your breath soften. Let the rhythm of your heart match the distant drums of time. Let the mountain fade into snow and silence. Thank you for listening. And if you're still awake, I'm honored to have kept you company. If this story brought you peace, feel free to leave a sign, a like, a quiet subscription, or even just a whispered thought in the comments. And now, as the last candle flickers low, and the wind settles on the stones, sleep well, you are safe, and the mountain watches over you. Good night.